What happens when someone feels pushed too far? When perceived injustices just keep piling up, and an ordinary person, well, they decide they've finally had enough.
It's a scary thought, isn't it?
It really is. And what extraordinary, maybe even horrifying lengths might someone go to if they're truly convinced they're justified?
Sure.
Today we're doing a deep dive into an event that absolutely stunned a small American town and really the whole nation. Back in 2004, we're talking about the Granby, Colorado Bulldozer Rampage.
That's right. An absolutely wild story.
We're going to sift through the sources, try to understand the many layers of this incredible event, from the meticulous, almost obsessive planning that went into it.
Okay, the planning was something else.
To the shocking destruction. And, well, the questions it still raises about grievance, about power, and what happens when, as Nam himself said, reasonable men are pushed to unreasonable things.
It really forces you to look at the human psyche under immense pressure. And that's what we'll dig into. At the center of it all is this man, Marvin Heemeyer, and his truly unprecedented decision to take revenge.
Right.
We'll look at the deep-seated reasons that drove him, the sheer scale of what he did with that machine, that modified bulldozer.
The killdozer.
The killdozer, yeah. And how his actions sparked this really intense, often very divisive, debate about justice, self-defense, the very limits of protest when someone feels ignored by the system.
So let's start with the man himself. Marvin Heemeyer, he was, 52 years old, a muffler shop owner in Granby, Colorado.
Tiny town, yeah, about 1,500 people.
Right, a small mountain town. And on the surface, he seemed like just a regular guy, maybe a bit unassuming even.
Just part of the community.
Exactly. Yet this seemingly average man became the architect of one of the most bizarre, most destructive acts of defiance many people had ever seen. The big question is, how did he even get to that point?
Well, like you said, it wasn't sudden. These frustrations they've been building up for years. We're talking dating back to maybe 1992, even earlier potentially.
Wow, over a decade.
Yeah. And the core of it, the real flashpoint, seems to be these zoning disputes, specifically around the Mountain Park concrete plant.
Which was right across the street from his muffler shop.
Directly across.
Yeah.
He bought his land in 92, planning to build his shop. Then later, the town approves this concrete plant right next door.
Okay.
And Heemeyer felt, the dust, the noise, the truck traffic. It was directly hurting his business, making it hard for customers to even get there or want to be there.
And it wasn't just the plant's existence, right? He tried to find a workaround.
He did. His frustration grew when he asked the town council for permission to build a new access road for his customers, sort of bypassing the plant traffic.
And they said no.
They denied it. And that's when Heemeyer really started to believe, or at least say, that the town council was basically bowing to big money, his words, at the expense of the little guy, like him. He saw it as them choosing the bigger company over his small business.
And there was another layer too, wasn't there? Something about the land itself.
Yes, that's right. It adds another twist. He'd bought his property at a public land auction, standard enough.
Okay.
But later, he finds out the previous owner, the guy who was losing the property, was actually bidding against him at that auction, trying to buy it back.
Oh, wow.
And according to some sources, this same previous owner had allegedly kind of annexed a piece of that property under the table with the town's cooperation without Heemeyer knowing.
So Heemeyer felt cheated.
Completely. Betrayed, trapped. He even tried to sell the land back to this previous owner, but the deal fell apart because the guy apparently just didn't have the cash. So Heemeyer felt stuck. Stuck with land he thought was depreciating, surrounded by what he saw as like a conspiracy against him.
Okay, so these ongoing disputes, this feeling of being wronged by the town, by neighbors, it clearly took a huge toll over years. But things escalated in the year leading up to the attack, right?
They did. It wasn't just the town issues. In 2004, the year of the Rampage, his father passed away. And around the same time, his romantic relationship ended. So you have these major personal losses hitting him right when these long simmering disputes are maybe reaching a boiling point.
A perfect storm, really. Personal grief piled on top of what he saw as official corruption and betrayal.
Exactly. It likely pushed him into a much more isolated, distressed state of mind, fertile ground for a radical decision.
And that decision was, well, extreme doesn't quite cover it.
No, it doesn't. He decided to modify this bulldozer, a Komatsu D335A, into what became known as the killdozer.
Tell us about this machine. It wasn't just some plating bolted on.
Oh, no, this was a serious piece of DIY, armored vehicle construction. We're talking a 30-ton shell, multiple layers of steel plate, concrete poured in between, making armor up to a foot thick in some places.
A foot thick.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. Completely enclosed cabin. He set up monitors linked to external cameras so he could see, even rigged up air nozzles to blow dust off the camera lenses. He thought of almost everything.
The level of planning is just astounding. Months of work, all done in secret inside his muffler shop.
Working away, sealing himself inside this thing.
And before he started the Rampage, he actually mailed audio tapes to his brother, I think.
That's right. Several takes detailing his intentions, laying out all his perceived injustices point by point, even listing his specific targets. It showed cold, calculated intent.
Yeah, chillingly calculated.
And the psychological side of this preparation, it's pretty stark. A friend of his, Bonnie Brown, she mentioned later how Heemeyer had talked about paying back the people who'd harmed him. This was months earlier, like January of that year.
And she didn't take it seriously.
She said she thought he was just kidding. I had no idea he'd actually build tank and go through with it. It just shows how deep that internal resentment must have run, becoming this all-consuming thing while maybe outwardly seeming like just bitter talk. He was engineering his final act.
And this is where it gets even more disturbing, I think. He seemed to genuinely believe he was doing God's work.
Yeah, that's a really unsettling layer to it. In the materials he left behind, he actually said, and I'm quoting here, "God bless me in advance for the task I'm about to undertake. It is my duty. God has asked me to do this. It's a cross that I'm going to carry, and I'm going to carry it in God's name."
Wow. He saw it as a divine mission.
He did. He even apparently took the fact that none of his customers questioned this massive, weird thing he was building inside his shop as a sign. Like divine protection, reinforcing his belief he was on the right path.
So the stage was set, June 4th, 2004, mid-afternoon, around 3 p.m.
Yep, that's when it started. Heemeyer, sealed inside his homemade tank, busts through the walls of his own muffler shop, almost like, cutting his last tie.
And then straight for the first target.
Immediately, drove right across the street to the Mountain Park concrete plant, the very place that was the source of so much of his anger for so long.
Yeah, people tried to stop him right away.
They did. The plant owner reportedly tried using a front-end loader to block him, but Heemeyer allegedly fired shots from a .50 caliber rifle mounted inside the dozer.
Fired shots.
Yeah.
So not just property damage from the start.
Right. It forced the owner to flee. It became terrifyingly clear, very fast, this wasn't just vandalism, it was something much more dangerous.
And the destruction escalated quickly.
Within minutes, yeah. 2 buildings, several vehicles at the concrete plant were destroyed. Then the bulldozer lumbers onto the highway.
Pursued by police.
Multiple emergency vehicles, yeah. One police SUV actually tried to block its path.
Yep.
It just crushed, and the killdozer rolled right over it like it was nothing. A toy car.
Unbelievable. So what could law enforcement even do against this thing?
Honestly, very little. Their efforts were pretty desperate and totally ineffective at that point. The undersheriff, Glenn Traynor, he actually managed to climb on top of the moving bulldozer.
While it was moving.
Yeah. Climbed up and opened fire with his service weapon, but bullets, whether from handguns, shotguns, rifles, even explosives they apparently tried later, nothing got through that armor.
Just bounced off.
Witnesses said bullets were just ricocheting off the steel plates. He was basically untouchable inside this thing, a ghost in the machine, just plowing through town.
So as this is happening, people in Granby must have been terrified.
Absolutely. A wave of fear swept through the town. And because nobody knew exactly who or what Heemeyer was targeting next.
They didn't have his list yet.
Right. The authorities issued a public alert using the reverse 911 system, basically calling residents, telling them to evacuate or take cover immediately. Widespread panic in this small community.
But Heemeyer, he did have a list. He knew exactly where he was going.
Oh, definitely. He systematically targeted places linked to his grievances. It was like he was checking them off.
Like Town Hall?
Yep. Town Hall, the place he blamed for his zoning losses. He tore right through it. Then he went for the local newspaper office, the Grand County Transcript.
Why them?
He felt they hadn't done enough to publicize his complaints against the town. Didn't give his side enough attention. And then, maybe the most chillingly personal target, the home of a former judge. This judge had ruled against him in some past dispute.
But the judge wasn't even alive anymore.
No, the judge himself had died years before. But his widow still lived in the house. He destroyed it anyway. It showed this laser focus on settling scores, regardless of the passage of time or, well, anything else.
Just pure revenge. How long did this all last?
Just over 2 hours, which is an astonishing amount of time for one person to cause so much destruction unchecked.
And the damage.
By the time it was over, 13 buildings were either severely damaged or totally destroyed. The total cost was estimated around $7 million. An incredible scale of destruction for one man and one machine. Left a huge scar on Granby.
So how did it finally end? What stopped him?
The end came, somewhat anticlimactically in a way, at a hardware store. One Gamble's hardware store.
He targeted that too.
It seems so. He crashed through the building, but the floor gave way and the Bulldozer fell into the basement.
And got stuck.
Yeah, it finally became trapped. Not really stopped by force from the outside, but more overwhelmed by the accumulated damage from its own rampage, maybe the engines finally failing, and just the sheer weight of all that added armor. It got bogged down.
And Heemeyer.
Once the machine was completely stuck, immobilized, Marvin Heemeyer took his own life inside the Bulldozer's cabin.
So he never intended to get out.
It certainly seems that way. And getting his body out was a huge challenge for law enforcement. They tried explosives to breach the armor, but that failed.
Really? Even explosives?
Yeah. It ended up taking 12 hours using an oxyacetylene cutting torch to finally cut through the shell and get inside. That alone tells you he probably planned it as a one-way trip. Final vengeance, and then that was it.
The aftermath must have been intense, not just cleaning up the physical damage.
Oh, absolutely. Heemeyer's actions left this huge impact, not just on Granby, but really on the wider public discussion, created this incredibly complex, very divisive perception of him. Well, for some people, especially maybe those who feel powerless against big institutions or government, he became a kind of folk hero.
A folk hero?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah. Seen as someone who took an extreme stand against what they perceived as abuse of power, a lone wolf fighting back. That quote of his, "Sometimes reasonable men just do unreasonable things," really resonated with some folks.
People who feel ignored by the system.
Exactly. They saw him as this symbol of defiance against, uncaring governments and impossible odds.
Well, that can't be the only view, surely.
Oh, definitely not. The whole question of how reasonable Heemeyer actually was and what his real intent was, that's fiercely debated.
Right.
His supporters often point out that, miraculously, no one else was killed. They use that as evidence he only intended to destroy property, not harm people.
But critics disagree.
Strongly. Critics argue the lack of deaths wasn't for lack of trying. There are widespread claims he deliberately shot at large propane tanks during the rampage.
Which could have caused massive explosions.
Exactly. Interpreted by many as a clear attempt to kill nearby officers or civilians. His supporters, though, they maintain he only shot the tanks to cause more property damage, not to kill anyone. It's impossible to know his true intent there.
And there's more that complicates that property-only narrative, isn't there? Like the timing.
Yes, that's a huge point. The fact is, 11 of the 13 buildings he targeted were occupied. It was the middle of a weekday afternoon.
Midday. Busy time.
Right. And the most chilling example is the library. It was attached to the town hall. There were school children inside for a program until just minutes before he hit the building.
He couldn't have known they had left.
No way. Sealed inside his machine, he had no idea it was empty. Which raises that really difficult question. If he truly, absolutely only wanted to destroy property and not hurt anyone, why choose 3 p.m.? Why not 3 a.m. when the buildings and streets would have been deserted?
That's a very good question. It casts a lot of doubt on the harmless intent idea.
It does. And to stop the Bulldozer itself from becoming some kind of, morbid shrine or symbol.
Right, people might want pieces of it.
Exactly. The authorities made a conscious decision after everything. They had the remains of the Bulldozer broken down into smaller pieces.
Okay.
And then trucked off to several different undisclosed scrapyards across the country.
Yeah.
Deliberately scattered, basically, to prevent anyone from collecting souvenirs or turning it into some kind of monument.
Smart move.
Yeah.
Probably necessary.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up our deep dive here, Marvin Heemeyer's story, it's just profoundly complex, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's this stark reminder of how personal grievances, especially when they feel tied to systemic unfairness, and then you add personal turmoil on top, how that can all escalate into something truly unimaginable.
It's not just some crazy headline. It's a really chilling look at how bureaucratic friction, perceived betrayal, personal loss, how that can all combine and potentially radicalize someone who might otherwise seem ordinary.
It really forces you, the listener, to think about those difficult lines. Where does individual protest cross over into destructive vengeance? What does it actually take for a person to get to that point where they believe they're acting on some higher calling, even if it involves such chaos and, frankly, disregard for the safety of others?
Yeah.
And how do we as a society even process the legacy of an event like this, where one person's, fight for justice is seen by others as an act of domestic terrorism? It makes you look at those feelings of powerlessness, maybe in ourselves too.
It certainly does. A lot to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a truly unforgettable and deeply troubling event. We hope it gives you some perspective, and we encourage you to reflect on the nuances here and the broader questions this story raises.